Nobody does that around the world. It sticks out like in the sky. You do that on Carling and Preston. It's a beautiful building, but it's crazy. 45 floors is crazy. Now, you talked about the Peace Tower. It's beautiful. The old city, the downtown, the old buildings are very nice. If you continue like that, you will not see any Peace Tower anymore. And also the parkway and the grass, all this will basically disappear with all this concrete. Now, I don't care that much. I tell you honestly, I'm 72. By the time it's done, I won't be here anyway. But I really think 45 floors, you should think about it. That's my major beef. I think I looked at buildings here downtown when I came here. I counted the floors. 20 to 30 to 25 is reasonable. More than that, unbelievable, unbelievable. You show me a place in the world where, again I repeat, where a city of 1 million people have that. You have that in Frankfurt, Germany, but what? It's a financial center of the world, and it's only office towers, not high-rise for living. So I'm sorry, that's my opinion. As I said, there's only 2 places in the world I was thinking about where a city has 1 million or less, where they have that, and it's Abu Dhabi and Doha, nowhere else. Maybe you want to reinvent the world, it's possible, but I think it's too high. And I know it's done because of greed, because it brings in more taxes, and it also makes more profit for the builder. But he can make profit at 25 floors too. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Jacob. I'm looking around. I see no questions from the panel members. Thank you for coming out today. At this point, I will call up the applicant, George Dark. George, if you want to come take a seat. And welcome back. We haven't seen you here for quite a while, so...
Now, Mr. Chair, my presentation is actually way over there. So
yeah, you can go ahead and sit beside Andrew if you wish.
Can I go over there? Yeah, thanks. Sorry.
Great. As we work on technical issues, I will remind committee members this is on the shared drive, so you do have access to this presentation. Also, Mr. Dark, if you want to take the opportunity, feel free to turn your mic on, and we won't hold the time against you. If you could introduce who's at the table with you right now, first of all.
There, is that on? Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is George Dark. I'm the managing partner of a firm called Urban Strategies from Toronto. Thank you. I'm really pleased to be back. I haven't been here for a while. And East Flats is something we've been working on for some time. This is my associate, Tim Smith. And we have also, in case there are questions, brought our transportation consultant who produced the report that is part of the submission, if you would have questions relative to his technical work.
Great. So you've been here before, not your first rodeo. We'll reset the clock to 5 minutes, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. You know, East Flats has been interesting for us. It has been several years. I would say that certainly we are here today in full support of the report that staff has in front of you, and I would certainly thank them for all of the critical analysis that they put into the file over the last several years. It's always very helpful for us in refining these things. You all know where this is. This is a transformational place. Years and years ago, it showed up on our downtown auto urban design strategy as the portion below the escarpment piece. Of course, at that time, it was into a master plan, which probably is 15 years ahead of that, if I remember correctly. We spent a lot of time here trying to feed a busway through here, trying to understand the nature of how the BRT would come. There were several of those, and of course in the latest iteration it's become one of the most interesting sites on your new LRT because it is completely consistent with the LRT station. It's one of the pieces of land where the station area and the development site are actually immediately adjacent to each other. I think when I show you some of the pictures, you'll see that in fact you use this piece of land to walk into that station because it's lower, Booth is higher. You'll actually come across this site to walk into the station or use the elevators that are on the bridge. We have been working on this synthetic model of Ottawa for some time. You of course know that the west end and what we call the front of the city is a very dynamic piece of planning thinking. There are two sides to Le Breton now. There is the side which is Rendezvous Le Breton to the west and the Claridge Peach which is to the east. It's also, if you've walked down there, a configuration of some really interesting and very old historic bridges, aqueducts, all still in place. The good thing is that most of these would all end up in public parkland. They're all on land that you own now or is intended to go into public parkland. I'll show you some pictures in a second, but some of it will come from LRT, some of it can come from your new library, some of it you already own, some of it is involved in Pooley's Bridge, some of it can actually be delivered by this development. I think Andrew did point out the very interesting thing of Booth being highly elevated to get over the existing bridge, which means the land is down and Booth is up. And so what we've been working on is to take the buildings and actually have them meet the grade. So these buildings are almost like a back split. On Booth Street, they'll be built to the grade of the street, which will totally normalize it. You won't have buildings below the street in a pit. In essence, we'll be able to set those buildings up to street grade. We have to put a much wider streetscape in place to accomplish that because Booth will go across, the face of the building will terrace itself down. But that leads you up into the center portion of the site. And it would leave a very small part essentially over top of the aqueduct at the higher level where you would look down into park space. From the outer edge of the southern parcel over to the LRT would entirely be open space across the top of Booth Street in this configuration. And this is an imagery of the amount of land that is in there. Now we have not successfully decoded all of the treatments that will be happening with the LRT. The new library, as you know, is still under consideration, but this is essentially the backyard of the new library, the access point into the Pismi LRT station to the top left-hand corner, the outfall of the covered aqueduct that's in a tunnel or a vault, and the northern walkway goes up and goes across to Pooley's Bridge. Properly dealt with, all of these lands could be configured into a pretty significant historically driven park space. There you can see the moment of that. There's a very large opening in this site. Development occurs on the outside. There's the model of your new library pegged in as well. So you can see the library and the future park would have a strong relationship to each other. You would also use that space to walk from the library to the LRT station. You'd use the southern tier of the walkway to do that. There's a very strongly worked out interconnection system of walking and bicycles leading you from the bicycle paths that are up in the center portion past the Whitewater Way down into the station as well as from the community. There are a series of towers. We have been adjusting them. We have analyzed views. We have analyzed shadows. There was, of course, a request to ensure our shadow would never go through the window of the War Museum on Remembrance Day, and we've done that study to ensure that wouldn't happen.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Dark. I'm looking around the table. Is there any questions to our delegation? Catherine McKenney.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Dark, for your presentation. I just want to ask about the couple of things. One is the proximity of buildings, and I think it came up earlier this morning. The fact that we've got 5 buildings that are, you know, they're space, but certainly they all have pretty significant height. I think 45 stories is excessive, but the others I would say are at least significant height, and there will be shadowing. There can't not be. And they are being proposed by the same developer that actually built a bit of a lower rise neighborhood, just to the east. How do you respond to residents who bought into the first phase and live in what I think is a great neighborhood for public realm? If you go to LeBreton Flats Phase 1 and just walk around the public space, it is actually quite inviting. It's a bit private now. That will be less so as we integrate more cycling and pedestrian connectivity, but this will certainly have an impact on those residents in terms of shadowing, especially the 45-story building, which would come in a second phase. How do you respond to that? How do you respond to the concerns that, and I share them, that it's, especially 45 stories is just too high?
Right. That's an excellent question, Councillor. I think there are a couple things, and this is a good image to look at that. The buildings are what are considered to be point towers. They're not long slabs. They're reasonably small floor plates that are more square in shape. This would mean that a shadow doesn't cast a long projected over the ground. It's a reasonably small one, which means it moves over the ground more quickly. Now, I will also say that a choice has been made to put the towers on base buildings, which we would call a podium building. You can see from this image that the towers are pulled away from the existing smaller neighborhood. Now, the existing condo, you can see, is back. It's almost in a piece of land by itself at some distance from these towers. But the base buildings allow you to have a scalability and a building at the street level that's different than a tower. The other thing, of course, is we have had different configurations of these towers over time. The smaller at 25 being inboard, the arrangement of these towers is to put the tallest one the furthest away to create the best sun acuity on the plan. The other thing, of course, that's interesting is that with your orientation, these buildings would all be on the north side of the park system, so there isn't really an implication to the central park system that's there. So I think it's important that the urban design of the tower form remain point tower, that it still be put onto a very reasonably scaled podium base. In this case, it's a 2-story to 3-story base, and that this massing away from the existing community and over more significantly into the location of the LRT station is the proper way to deploy. Remembering there will also be a secondary tier of development south of the LRT as well, which essentially will also be on the LRT station that could allow for additional transition going into the much lower single-family neighborhood to the south. That would be our technique.
And we did have a public meeting where, we did have, as it's indicated in the report, about 140 people show up. And a lot of the discussion, while some of it was on height, a lot of it was on traffic impacts, but most of it was about the relationship to the existing neighborhood and what that looks like and what that feels like. And whenever we are building a community that is being proposed here today, the biggest concern is often that they will not integrate well with the existing community, and they won't if in fact they're just a podium and a high rise, and there's no transition, there's no active frontage. Townhouses, for example, on the ground floor, and then step back and transition back to the high rise. But at least you will come together in the public space, if you will, the way the residents do today. There's, as I say, there's excellent public space, and it's that human scale that is so important. I often say that heights can be good and bad, but it's the way it transitions into its existing neighborhood and the impact that it has on the ground. And I'm not seeing here today, and I've not heard how the applicant intends to ensure that transition to the height, and to ensure that there are people living on the ground, working on the ground, and being on the ground, and connecting with each other, with the existing neighborhood and this new proposed one. Could you give us some assurance that that is being seriously considered here?
Right. So I think, again, it's an excellent question. I've changed the image. We have a very strong streetscape system that's being put in place in here. I think we understand lots of people will walk through here to get to the LRT station. They can choose many routes to do so. Some people may walk down Booth Street and take the elevator, which is why Booth Street has such a wide boulevard actually attached to it. One of the changes is also to bring retail institutional users into the Podium building. So, for example, this is looking down at the top of Booth. If there was a food store here, it would likely be up on this corner. So one could find, this is zoning, it's not site plan. What we're attempting to do is allow for those commercial uses to come in against those streets. If a commercial use wasn't done, Councillor, in a development of a site plan, you could create units that would go out at grade, a kind of townhouse form. The Podium building is very conducive to that. And if that was something that from a market standpoint, even from a live-work standpoint would work, you could do that architecturally. But the biggest change here would be to allow for commercial uses to come down and put shop fronts against the actual sidewalk walking to the LRT, and to control the height of that Podium building. You know, one of the techniques would be to spread more density into the podiums. Certainly in other cities you would see those being 4, 5, 6 stories tall. I think in this case we've made very modest podiums because they relate well to the cross-section of the street. So when you're walking in that street, you're dealing with a building that's much lower. But hopefully there will be a lot of service uses that can come into these Podium bases that will have doors you'll be going into. Certainly on Booth Street, to me, that would be very important as a primary walk down to the LRT station.
And I appreciate that, but I'm also considering the existing residences on Let and the transition from Let and Fleet, so that existing neighbors are not looking at just a tall blank wall.
Right.
Councillor, if I may add, the zoning map that city staff are recommending be approved, it actually requires active uses on all our frontages. On Let Street in particular, on the east side of Let Street, there will be a requirement for grade-related uses. So the experience you have on the east side of Let Street will be similar on the west side. So townhouse-type units embedded into the podium of the buildings that address that street. And all the other frontages along Lloyd and Fleet Street will also have these active uses. And I think, I mean, we do appreciate the concerns around building height. A lot of it is tied to the density we think is needed to actually support those active uses. So you made a very good point about the quality of the public realm and the liveliness of the public realm being important to supporting a real sense of community. To us, that's about the quality of streetscapes and the park that's being proposed, but also making sure that we have those active uses. And the fact is, we just won't have the critical mass to support more than one cafe, more than one restaurant, a sizable food store, unless we have a decent amount of density that really requires more than 6 or 12-story buildings.
Okay, thank you. My other questions are for staff.
Thank you for that. I'm looking around the table and see no more questions for the delegation. Mr. Dark, thank you for coming out today. We do appreciate that. At this time, I'll turn the floor over to questions to staff. Councillor Nussbaum.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, just a question to staff. In the staff presentation, there was a mention of the fact that there are no protected views in this particular area. I appreciated the discussion or the profile of the Peace Tower. But in looking at the staff presentation and also Mr. Dark's presentation, we note that this site is in close proximity to the site for the new Central Public Library. And one of the selling points of this site in the whole grading process for the Central Public Library site were the views north and west to the Ottawa River, etc. And I'm just wondering whether staff evaluated this zoning application in the context of the fact that we have later this meeting another zoning application for the library site. So the question is, in what ways did we anticipate that these views would be affected by the library, and to what extent were they taken into account in staff's evaluation of this application?
Thank you. Mr. Chair, luckily I had the benefit of being the file lead on both applications that were just referenced, and I worked very closely actually with both applicant teams. When I say that catch-all, I'm talking about internal and external stakeholders as well. On the central library piece, the view to the north won't change. That site is situated so that it has sort of a straight view down the Heritage Aqueduct and towards Fleet Station. We did work with looking at the Claridge proposal, the East Flats proposal, that's this item, and Central Library applicant team staff reviewed that and commented on that to make sure that there weren't any sort of negative impacts with sun shadowing or views. Even though there's no design yet for that facility, there's a lot of design criteria about open space and landscaping to make sure that when they look at that design framework, that this proposal wasn't going to have a negative impact on that. And there was sort of comfort all around that the two pieces would work well together, especially with the way the part that's covering the Heritage Aqueduct would be treated at the end of the day. So to answer the question, it was looked at, yes.
My next question is looking, and I'm looking actually at Mr. Dark's presentation, but in terms of the sequencing, the staff report acknowledges that this is a 15 to 20 year build out, and hence why there are holding symbols on some of the sites. What is the sequencing in terms of some of those public realm elements that Mr. Dark mentioned? So to what extent, for instance, the future park and some of those Booth Street streetscape improvements, how will that phasing work?
So, Mr. Chair, the first phase of development is intended to be the 30-story building at the corner of Booth and Fleet, which the podium itself actually goes almost the full extent of Booth. So I would anticipate that when that comes in as a site plan, we'll get the details for the treatment of Booth Street with that first application and wrapping around the corner of Fleet and whatever the design is on Lloyd Street. So almost completing that block from the active pedestrian realm perspective. There's also, we've put in the policy in the site-specific policies surrounding parks and open space, that there's going to be a coordinated effort to ensure that the parkland, the area that's covered over the aqueduct, is intended to be ready in conjunction with that first phase of development. We've been having lots of discussions with the applicant. There's a great amount of interest from all parties to make sure that that space is done, and it's done with the first phase. The reality is, we've talked to the Parks Department as well, if there's not enough funds to have the full build out of that space, whatever the desired plan ends up being, parks are comfortable in that it can become rolled out in a phased entity. So with first phase of development, you should start seeing some improvements on that park space as well as the public realm treatment of the streets.
Thank you. And my last question relates to the fact that across the street from this proposed application, we've got a very large application, which is part of the NCC's LeBreton Flats redevelopment. To what extent did staff consider what was potentially going to be happening directly across Booth Street from the proposed site?
It's, Mr. Chair, that's rather difficult to answer at this point. We haven't received any of those formal applications for the Illumination LeBreton bid. We can only derive the information that we've seen from the public consultations that happened last year. But what we do know is that the treatment of Booth Street with that bridge condition was very important. As the applicant talked about, making sure that it wasn't just a building beside a bridge with a pit condition, that building marriage to that street condition and made sure there was an active frontage. We'll be having the same conversation with respect to Booth Street on the west side with Illumination LeBreton. We also looked at those plans to ensure that the active frontage is all around makes sense, And at the aqueduct level, there's room actually to pass under the bridge, and we know there's plans there for MUP connections, which again, we'll be having those discussions with the applicant as they come in on the west side of Booth. So they were considered as much as they could be at this point in time.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Councillor McKenney.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Nussbaum did ask some of the questions I was looking for answers I was looking for. Just to clarify, though, around the public realm and any enhancement on the park space, Section 37 is not kicking in Phase 1. Is that correct?
That is correct. The first phase of development does not trigger Section 37.
Okay. But there will be an opportunity for more cash and lieu parkland that can be used to enhance the parkscape?
Yes, through the chair, if the ward councillor being yourself wants to use the cash and lieu parkland from that first phase of development, the site-specific policy that goes along with this provides that direction that could be a possibility.
And when would you see Section 37 kicking in?
I would anticipate that when the second phase comes in, we'll reach that threshold. And the other thing I want to qualify is we've set it up sort of twofold in the policy. The very last page on the document compares the as-of-right density from today versus the full build-out. But from a review process, it'll actually be looked at on a phase-by-phase basis. So whether it's triggered per phase or as an overall, it'll get caught in both instances.
And on traffic and the impacts on traffic, I know we did hear from Mr. McKenna today about some of the residents who have an issue with the kind of the detour that has to be taken to get out, and that goes back to the 2006 site plan agreement that was always meant to be in place, wasn't, and a favor once conferred on, becomes something that people expect. So on the traffic impacts for the existing neighbors, and then with the addition of Phase 1, what do you see happening in terms of the access and egress to this location using, at this point, it's Lett Street, not Lett Street, but Wellington onto Lett Street?
Thank you. So, Mr. Chair, city staff and the applicant actually did a tremendous amount of work on traffic. When the application was first submitted, the original transportation impact study looked at the full concept for the whole development. So full build out as if all 5 towers were built right away, and looked at what that impact would be. There was several concerns when we looked at the full kind of concept, and wanted to break it down to understand what happens in the first phase, because there's a lot of assumptions in that larger concept, given that it could take 15 to 20 years to happen. And with Confederation line coming into operation, the traffic in this area is subject to significantly change. So we had the applicant do a second analysis, a full TIA, with just looking at the first phase. What we discovered in reviewing that in that second document was that the first phase of development works. It works with using the existing Fleet Street condition, which is a right in, right out, and it works with the full signalized intersection at Lett and Wellington. And when I say works, I'm talking about all modes of transportation, so pedestrian movements, cyclist movements, and transportation movements. That work was done using our new transportation impact assessments and making some assumptions about modal splits and targets, and based on how this area may evolve in the future with the station. Because that's somewhat of an unknown, you'll see in the zoning details that we put all the subsequent phases in a holding zone, and one of those conditions is monitoring the impacts of that first phase of development. And as each phase comes in for site plan or lifting that holding exercise, we're going to have to look at the impacts from that first phase and build in provisions for that application current to what's happening at that time, with other developments that are happening in the area and with the traffic impacts that are real. So we've set it up that way because there were concerns about future phases, but we're just not sure how the traffic's going to evolve in this immediate area over that time.
Thank you for that. But what levers do you have at that point to, if today we're accepting a full application, and I understand that there are holds for various reasons on the next phases. But what can happen if we find out, if we realize, you know what, on a lot of levels this isn't working, say traffic, what can we do? Can we hold the phase 2 until more people are taking light rail, until our modal split is better? Like, what's the lever that we have?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I think the leverage is the holding zone itself, which, as you can see, there's a number of items in that holding zone provision. One of them is traffic. If they can't demonstrate that those additional phases are working, we have to work through that conversation, and we'll lift the hold when it's demonstrated that it works. That could result in a number of outcomes. Change to looking at how traffic works in the neighborhood. It could even result in a change to the density in the proposal. We don't know at this time, but that is the leverage, the holding symbol itself.
Thank you. And my last question is on the affordable housing component and the child care component. That was built into the 2007 agreement. It is unique in the city that we have this. It's something that I hope as we move along in building our city, that it becomes part of an inclusionary zoning policy. But we do have an agreement for real affordability and childcare. And that affordability, at my understanding, is that it is 25%, and it does lead us right to the 20th percentile, which is a deep affordability. I think it's 7% at 20th, 9 at 30, and 9 at 40. I just want to make sure I'm correct on that. And could you tell me how that will get built in, and how we are absolutely assured that that will get built into the agreement and that it will happen when phase 1 is built?
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chair, the assurance at this point in time is the subdivision agreement itself, and you're correct on the percentages being 20, 30th, and 40 at 7, 8, and 8%. And we've already been in touch with our housing group through Saeed, and I think Claridge has been talking to them about what that looks like from an affordable housing agreement perspective. The next step in terms of your assurance would be the conditions through site plan control. So when that first phase of development comes in through the site plan application, that's where that implementation piece comes in, when we get into the specific details of how many units are proposed in that first phase, how many units of that development are affordable, and the condition that ties it to the next agreement, which would be the affordable housing agreement. So the subdivision agreement puts it out there in terms of an idea, if I could phrase it that way, and the site plan agreement will put it out as an implementation piece.
Thank you. And I know I said that was the last question, but I do have one more. It's a bit more broad-based. Because when we did have the open house, it was to really look at that entire corridor from 400 Albert, you know, with the library, this development, 900 Albert. Like, we are building really a small city in a very short space. And, you know, it's been brought up again today. Where are the schools going to be? Where are the recreation centers going to be? How do we ensure that we're providing the amenities? You know, grocery store is great. Obviously, it's needed, and that will come with people. But how do we as a city ensure that, you know, if we were building this type of density out anywhere else, it would be a small city, and there would be schools, there would be libraries. There is a library here, mind you, but there would be all of those amenities, recreation centers, that the current capacity in the current neighborhood, it's just not there.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's an excellent question, and you know, a discussion we have with every application. What I can say is, for this committee, the way we've set up the site-specific policies and the zoning, it's a framework that allows that to happen. There's a wide variety of amenities, commercial, institutional uses that are permitted in this zoning, and the policies speak to encouraging that type of development at this location. It, you know, becomes a council decision of how we enforce that and ensure that, you know, we use the tools that we have available to us, which is the zoning we put in place and the policies specific to this project. And then when we come to a site plan stage where you get the more specific makeup of a building. What I mean by makeup is the mixed-use configuration of what's actually going into that project. Then it becomes a discussion with the applicant about making sure, hey, this community needs, you know, a community facility or some sort of use that's lacking, and it becomes a negotiation or discussion at that point in time. But I can tell you that the framework we've set up for this project can allow that to happen.
Great. Councillor Lieber.
Thank you, Chair. And I do want to just pick up on Councillor McKenney's line of questioning there, because we both share a concern that as probably 10, 20,000 people move in from the escarpment through the Churchill along that corridor, that the amenities are there to support those residents with a sustainable community, with a community that offers quality of life. And I note that Mr. Willis is here, and I would ask him, there are facilities that are traditionally provided by municipalities in order to support quality of life in neighborhoods. And I think one of the key ones is the recreation center. It offers the rehearsal space for the local theater company. It offers the pool in which municipal programming like parent and taught classes, older adult classes, learn to swim classes are taught. We see things like the recreation center has the space in which you have the yoga classes. I'm absolutely certain that this development will have private amenities. It will almost certainly have an indoor pool, but that's not where you teach your kids to swim. How do we intend, Mr. Willis, to ensure that we have those facilities that the municipality would traditionally provide to support quality of life? How are those facilities going to come in as we build out the spine of the Confederation line from the escarpment to Churchill Avenue?
Mr. Chair, normally when individual development applications come in, these sorts of matters are left to master planning from the municipality to address, and so the city will have recreation master planning. And actually one of the requirements of the new official plan that we need to adopt in the next term of council is we need to address these issues more specifically. So with the growth and intensification that there is a degree of concentration, it would be through those master planning exercises that we would do. In addition, the Recreation and Culture Facilities Department does do periodic reviews of client demand in various areas, and it would need to be addressed through one of those future reviews.
Where are we for the review for the urban facilities that would pertain to this particular location?
Chair, I'm sorry, I'm unable to answer that question because we'll reach out to the other department to find out, to RCFS to find out what their timing is. But my expectation is it would need to be done in the next 2 or 3 years, particularly when we update the official plan.
It is important. We can't divorce the land use planning approvals that we're doing through zoning and site plan. We can't divorce those from understanding how the neighborhood is going to evolve from a transportation perspective, from a facilities perspective, from an infrastructure perspective. And it strikes me that, particularly with the density of housing that we are proposing to do here, that we're approving the buildings ahead of understanding how the community is actually going to be livable, to Mr. McKenna's point. And that is uncomfortable for me today, being asked to approve this. So I look forward to some more details before this comes to council. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Great. Councillor Kadri.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And just coming back to staff about the question that Mr. McKenna raised about public consultation, I did read the report. It does mention in there that there has been public consultation. I just want Mr. McCree to give us the in-depth scenario on that public consultation, please.
Sorry, my mic was being slow at turning back on. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, yes, public consultation. Mr. McKenna did mention, if I'm going back to the beginning, that the applicant, Claridge Homes, had a full public meeting back in January 2019. That was prior to any applications being submitted, so staff was not involved at that point in time, other than we were aware of it, but there was no participation, so to speak. When the applications came in, we went through sort of the standard council approved processes with signs on the property and notification to everyone within 120 meters. What we also did for this one is created a little more information through our websites. So we've created a new website called ottawa.ca/LeBreton Flats, and it's a website focusing on what's happening in LeBreton Flats, development in LeBreton Flats, because it's in an area that's getting a lot of interest now and is going to change over the years. So it was introduced through that website, and then our DevApps portal as well. The ward councillor called for that open house meeting that we had in April, which was focused on more of a broader conversation, but it did focus on specific applications in the area, including this one, the library and LAC facility proposal, as well as 900 Albert. We had a good, healthy discussion. Not a lot of comments came back in from that open house, but they were welcomed. And of course, you know, through the normal review process, there was a lot of discussions with various individuals from the members of the public. I think what's important to note is that although the project itself didn't change significantly from when it was submitted to what you see before you today, the details in the specific policies that are part of the OPA and those details around that holding zone provision came out of conversations through public consultation, like the traffic concerns and the way we're thinking about that now and in the future.
Oops. Thank you for that, Mr. McCreed. Just a question though, you mentioned that the applicant did have a meeting or a public meeting prior to submitting an application in 2017, I'm presuming?
I believe it was January 2017, yes.
So would the proponent was not obligated to provide another public consultation after the plan was submitted?
The only obligated public meeting under the Planning Act would be the Planning Committee that we're at today.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Great. Thank you for that, Councillor Kadri. So seeing no further speakers, no questions to staff. Councillor Cloutier.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Just following up on Councillor Kadri's questions, you said there was not much change to the design of the building, but the height, I thought I heard earlier, the height did come down substantially. Is that correct?
Yes. On the point of height, when the item went to urban design review, it was prior to any applications being made, and it was 55 stories at that time, so it did get reduced to 45. My comment was more with respect to the proposal as it was when it was submitted. So it came in as the range of towers from 25 to 45.
Urban Design Review Panel was between the initial non-statutory public consultation in January 2017 and the application?
That's correct.
Correct. And when was Urban Design Review Panel?
It was, I believe, actually the same week, if not the following week, in January 2017, around the time that the applicant went out to the public on their own accord. We had design review within the same week of that meeting.
Reading the report, Mr. McKenna mentioned it, some of the other items that were mentioned were traffic. And you, in your answer to Councillor Kadri, you said that there were some changes to the traffic access egress. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
If I did say that to the councillor, I misspoke.
I may be implying, but what changes were done to traffic?
From a traffic perspective, there's not any changes in terms of the access and egress to the site as we know today. It's a right-in, right-out only at Booth and Fleet, and it's a full signalized intersection at Wellington Street. What we've done as a department to ensure that we're comfortable with traffic for the purpose of the OPA and zoning is ensuring that that first phase of development works and works in all aspects, from pedestrians, cyclists, and vehicle movements and access to quality public transit. The holding zone provisions is really, I think, what has come out of the review of this application specific to traffic, is making sure that we're monitoring the results from that first phase to see if they are meeting those intended targets from a modal split perspective, and building that into subsequent applications to make sure that traffic works on a phase-by-phase basis for the overall concept.
How many additional, what's the percentage, we mentioned 1,200 cars, what's the percentage of expected new vehicles in phase one?
I don't remember the exact amount. I don't know if the applicant's traffic guy can yell at the amount, but they were looking at the modal split with traffic being in the 15 to 20% range.
About 20%. Okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
So it's a relatively small amount if we're talking in phase.
Yes, because the amount of there's about 350 residential units in the first phase, and then the commercial component.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I'm looking at the board for real this time. Yeah, nobody on it. So seeing no further discussion, thank you very much for the presentation today. I'll just add a couple of points. I think we've given a good discussion on item number 1, almost an hour and a half. That's pretty good, guys. That being said, you know, this project in general, it sits along our largest investment as a city with light rail. We had the foremost expert in urban planning with George Dark coming out, and thank you for coming out and speaking with us today about the benefits of intensification and how this is a great opportunity for us. And for the last 2 terms I've sat on council, these councils have always preached intensification. You couldn't have a better pitch. So you can't really have it both ways. And I'm asking members of Planning Committee today to walk the walk and talk the talk and vote in favor of this application. So on this application, is it carried? Thank you. Item number 2. Application for demolition and new construction at 443 and 447 Kent Street. The alteration at 423 to 425 Mccloud Street. Property is located in the Centretown Heritage Conservation District, designated under Part 5 of the Ontario Planning Act. I'm looking, is there a Guy Lacroix? Guy Lacroix here to speak? Guy? Great. I get you to come down up front here as well. Next on deck, I'll actually get both to come down. Jack Hanna and Mindy Schiel. And while we're waiting for our delegations, we're also doing item 3 at the same time. They're both of the same nature. All right, Guy. If you bring the microphone right down your mouth, you have 5 minutes. I'll give you a 30-second warning. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I also want to thank the Heritage Committee for listening to all our concerns and was very appreciative. Also, Catherine McKinney for being very helpful in this situation. I'd like to talk about 3 points. Our property is right next to the proposal. So the first thing I'd like to bring, point I'd like to talk about, and also just to put it on record, is wherever there's going to be excavation close to the property line where they're going to be digging down, I was wondering what could be done to preserve our foundation and whether they can put up retaining walls like they've done on some properties on Gladstone where they're building right now. I've looked into it and I've been told sometimes what they could do is they could put retaining walls so that when they do the excavation and stuff like this, that it doesn't rattle loose and create problems for your foundations. That's one point I want to bring up and to see what could be done there. The second point I'd like to bring up is in terms of drainage. Our property, the way it works right now is our property slopes down from the property line towards our house, and then as well the house or the apartment building slopes back away from the apartment building. So it creates a little bit of a V for the water to come down, and even the driveway, it kind of all circulates down towards the driveways and towards the bottom of the property onto the street. Now right now the property's proposed, whenever there's a lot of water that comes down, it overflows right now onto our property and sometimes creates a bit of a problem. So in terms of the new proposal, there's nothing been really discussed about you know, the sloping away from our property line back towards their area, and in terms of drainage, like what are they doing for drainage, because it's a fairly big building. How are they going to deal with the water and getting the water away, especially since right now, like it is a problem for us a little bit, and if it's not like addressed, it will be definitely a bigger problem for us. And I have seen examples of big buildings, a couple examples where this wasn't addressed, And, you know, I've talked to people and they're like, well, you pretty much can assume they're going to take care. Well, I've seen examples where it's not addressed, and you can see that the water goes to the property line. These are landlords that I just know personally, and they showed me into this, and they said, make sure that this is done. So that's a point I'd like to bring up, that I want to make sure that something's done so that the water's sloped away from our property line, and how are they taking care of the drainage away. The third point is going to be based on magnificent tree that is between both property line, that's on the property line right now. The proposal is going to take down most of the trees around that whole area. And if you look at that whole corner of Mccloud, once they take those trees down, there will be basically, other than if they keep our tree, there will be just our tree, and there will be no trees for the entire block between Mccloud and Gladstone for about 6 houses up, other than the proposed new smaller trees that they're going to put in. So I really want to talk about the tree, the shared tree. Now, the Heritage Committee was fully on board in terms of trying to preserve this tree. Also, Catherine McKinney was on board with that, calling it, and I quote, its weight in gold. And so that's like a big concern of ours now. Like, we own that apartment building, and I mean, we could take the easy way out and just say, yeah, go ahead, cut the tree, we can get compensated for that. You know, that's money. Like, we can use the money right now, let me tell you. But at the same token, like, you know, there's more to it than that. There's the nature, there's the oxygen, like I've said before, like a tree like out by, you know, like Carlton Place or something like that, it doesn't grow as fast as a tree downtown. And that's because trees like CO2. And with lack of trees here, they grow 10 times faster. Well, okay, that's an exaggeration, but they grow a little bit faster. So, did you say 30 seconds? Oh, geez, okay. So yeah, I'd like to see what we can do to like preserve the tree, and they have taken steps, but we haven't heard anything left, and that's one thing I would really like for us to, you know, keep and not get rid of, and try to maintain as much of the roots and the canopy as possible. Thank you.
Thank you for that. We do have questions for you, Councillor Cloutier.
Merci, Monsieur Lacroix. Est-ce que vous comprenez le français?
Thank you, Mr. Lacroix. Do you understand French? Yes, I speak French. So you're not objecting yourself to this request. I'm sorry? You are in favor of this request.
You support the report.
Yes, I do support the proposal, although there's not enough to talk in terms of the tree yet.
Exactly. My point is, you'd like us to, and the overland water and grading and the care of the foundation are some of the concerns that you've brought up.
Oui.
And so I assure you we'll be able to ask staff after they when they do that
yes.
Those things are taken care of at site plan.
Part of the reason that wasn't brought in in terms of the community, because it was also much more of a personal note, and we were recommended to bring this up on a little bit more personally, because it doesn't affect the community as much. So that's why it's probably not talked as much in the proposal, as well as the drainage and stuff hasn't been really addressed much. That has been brought up, but it hasn't been really addressed yet. So that's why I'm bringing it up, like what is possibly going to be done with that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next, thank you very much. I don't see any further questions. Thank you very much, Mr. Lacroix. Next up, Jack Hanna from the Centertown Citizens Community Association.
Hi, I am here on behalf of the Centertown Community Association, and
I'm, is this on?
Is this working? There we go. Mindy Sechel, I'm a local resident.
I think we bring you good news. Over the past several months, our community association facilitated numerous meetings with neighborhood residents, the developer. We put those two parties together in the same room, and also with city planners and councillors. Plenty of meetings, plenty of conversation, plenty of email exchanges, a lot of work, much of it done by volunteers. Throughout all of this, people were flexible and reasonable. It was a good experience and an education on how parties with very differing interests can reach accord. The proposal emerged, which you have before you, is satisfactory to almost all the parties involved, and the Community Association supports it. We've come here today in the hope that there will be no changes. Thank you.
Okay, we do have a question from Councillor McKenney.
Thank you, Chair. It's more of a comment. Thank you for coming out and for all the work that you've done over the last couple of months. We have a much better proposal in front of us today with better streetscape along a street like Kent. Sometimes we think, you know what, it's just Kent Street, anything is better, which is true. But we can do better, and we have here. We've got a good setback. We'll have room for, you know, good landscaping and trees. And on trees, I just want to get an assurance from staff that we will continue to work very, very closely with the neighbor and the applicant. And our own arborist to ensure that we are doing absolutely everything we can to save that tree. I've made public comment that I would lift delegated authority on site plan if I didn't feel that we had taken all of the necessary steps to save that tree, and because it really is worth its weight in gold. If you go and visit, if you go and look at where it is and the type of shade that it provides, and it's, you know, essentially going to be alone within about a block once this development starts. It is really very critical that everything be done to save that tree.
Just to respond, Mr. Chair, yes, this is on the plan here. It's the tree right here. It's located along the property line. The applicant, and if they come to speak, has taken some cutouts into the building here to try to create at least a 3-meter radius around that. But yes, through the site plan control process that will be coming up with the development of the proposed building right here, we will certainly have conditions in there and work with the councillor and work with the applicant and the neighbor to take all steps necessary to help preserve that tree and the health of the tree.
Great, thank you for that. Thank you very much for the delegation coming out today, and I will also note that we also have written correspondence from Guy, which also spoke today, and Lucy Castell. So thank you very much to the delegations for coming out. We also have the applicant, Rod Leahy and Matthew McGella. Did you wish to speak today? Is there any specific questions to the applicant? I'll get you to come to the table. Councillor Cloutier-Hesse.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. My name is Matthew McGilligan. I'm with FO10 Consultants. I'm joined here by Rod Leahy.
Thank you, Chair. Merci. Monsieur Lacroix, you heard Monsieur Lacroix some of his concerns with respect to the site plan the work, the proximity of the work to his property, and can you provide us some information with respect to how you can assure that the foundation will be maintained? And
well, I guess as we move, there's three issues you brought up. The foundation work, as you move closer toward construction of the project, we would be taking a closer look at ensuring that no damage would take place. So we'd be then meeting with the contractor as well as soils engineers. And if some temporary shoring is required to ensure protection, that would be part of the construction process.
Will you meet with the neighbor?
Oh, sorry, that would be including, of course, meeting with the neighbor specifically on not only construction, techniques, but also timing of construction, going over what's going to take place to ensure he's brought up to date. The other with regards to the stormwater management. So one of the requirements of site plan approval is to ensure all of the, we control all the water flow within our property. And if there's any overland flow from his property that's historical, we ensure that is taken care of as well. And we are working very closely with city staff, our city tree conservation, as well as our own arborists to ensure the survival of the tree in question. And I think through the site plan process, that's being looked at. Right now, we've set the building back a minimum of 3 meters, for the most part 4 meters. We are ensuring with the arborists that's sufficient to ensure that it lives, and we also made a commitment at the Heritage meeting to restrict the amount of the damage to the crown of the tree as much as possible.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, Councillor. Seeing no further questions to the applicant, thank you very much for coming out today. So on the Built Heritage Subcommittee, recommendation is amended. Is that carried? And on item number 3, we do have some technical amendments. Councillor Hubley, if you could read that out.
Whereas report ACS 2018 PIE PS 0076 recommends the approval of amendment to the zoning bylaw to permit a 4-story residential at 443 and 447 Kent Street and 423 and 425 Mccloud Street, whereas the lands are being rezoned from TM 14H bracket 17 and R4S bracket 479 to R4S bracket XX1. And the community wishes to have an increased corner side yard setback for the new portion of the building, and whereas the increased corner side setback will result in a reconfiguration of the building footprint and site layout in terms of amenity area and parking. Therefore, be it resolved that Planning Committee recommends Council approve an amendment to Document 2, details of recommended zoning as follows. A, by adding the text TM14H bracket 17 and before the text R4S bracket 479 in item 1, by replacing the text corner side yard setback 0.9 meters with the text corner side yard setback 1.6 meter, and in item 2B, by adding the following text: the minimum corner side yard setback for the building existing on the date of the passing of this bylaw is OM. By deleting northern interior, D, by deleting northern interior lot line 0 meters in item 2B. And E, by replacing the text minimum required residential parking space 6 with the text minimum required residential parking space 4 in item 2B. By replacing F, by replacing the text minimum at grade communal amenity area 77.4 M2 with 32 meter area abutting the interior side lot line. Replace that with the text minimum at grade communal amenity does not have to be located in the rear yard nor abut a rear lot line, with at least one aggregate area of minimum 39 meters, and the total amenity area required is 85 meters squared in item 2B. And finally, G, by adding the text 21% of the lot area must be provided as landscaped area for the lot containing an apartment building low-rise, and be it further resolved that pursuant to the Planning Act subsection 34 bracket 17, no further notice will be given.
Welcome to my world on reading these things, by the way. That being said, on this item, is this carried? Great, thank you very much. And then, of course, the item as amended. Is that carried? Thank you. So before we move on to item number 4, I will announce that we are taking a recess from 12:30 to 1 o'clock for lunch break. That being said, we'll move on to item number 4, application to alter the Chateau Laurier, 1 Rideau Street, a property designated under part of the Ontario Heritage Act. At this point, we're going to just get right into the speakers. I'll get Linda Hode. She's reading a submission, so I'll get Linda up on deck. Andrew Waldron and David Jeans. If I can get those 3 up in the chairs for delegations, that would be great. right. Good morning, Linda. It's
Thank
not your
you.
first
Good
rodeo.
morning,
You have
members
5
of the Planning
minutes.
Committee and Mr. Chair. You see in me Peter Kaufman, who was unable to attend this morning due to a medical appointment. He would much rather be here, he tells me. Peter Kaufman, as some of you know, is an architectural historian and a professor in Carleton University's History and Theory of Architecture program. He writes, "The standards and guidelines for the conservation of historic places in Canada require that an addition to a heritage building be compatible with, distinguishable from, and subordinate to the historic building. The order of these requirements is not arbitrary. Compatibility is listed first because without it, the other two criteria are pointless. No building which does not pass the compatibility test can be considered to have met the standards and guidelines. That the proposed addition to the Chateau Laurier is not compatible with the historic building and its setting is no longer in dispute. Among those who have spoken out regarding the incompatibility are the founding director of the Canadian Centre for Architecture, a former NCC chief architect, 2 past presidents of the Society for the Study of Architecture in Canada, numerous architecture, landscape architecture, and heritage professionals, Heritage Ottawa, and scores of concerned citizens. Moreover, not even the addition's architect has attempted to make a case for the design's compatibility with its surroundings. In his remarks to the Built Heritage Subcommittee, Peter Clues chose instead to claim that the addition has a, quote, gentle and soft touch, unquote, that render it, quote, almost invisible, unquote. In other words, yes, it is incompatible, but no one will see it. The unfortunate reality is that architecture is never invisible, although the renderings of the addition attempt to persuade us otherwise by obscuring the design in deep shadow and hiding it behind trees. Given that the standards and guidelines require compatibility, and that everyone acknowledges that the addition and the chateau are not compatible, the remaining question is how to ensure that a substandard design does not get built in the heart of our national capital. For this, the people of Ottawa are completely dependent on you, our elected representatives. You have the authority and indeed the responsibility to maintain standards and enforce the Ontario Heritage Act. The Built Heritage Subcommittee has very appropriately recommended that the design be revisited. But as we seem to be in a somewhat murky procedural waters now, it's crucial that the Planning Committee put in place a process that ensures the following: that a genuine variety of design ideas will be considered, rather than merely variations on the current discredited theme. That broad, good faith, and meaningful consultation will be undertaken with a range of stakeholders. That the design resulting from this process will be subjected to the rigorous scrutiny of elected officials as required by the Ontario Heritage Act. The Chateau Laurier and its setting are powerful, beloved, and iconic emblem of Canadian identity. Any alteration must be overseen with strict vigilance, and anything less than excellence is unconscionable. Whether the eventual addition is magnificent, mediocre, or deplorable, whether it is loved or loathed by future generations, will be your most visible and lasting legacy as a committee and as a council. Please exercise your authority and responsibility as mandated by the Ontario Heritage Act to safeguard our heritage and your legacy. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Linda. As you're reading a submission, there's no questions, and we have Peter's submission on file as well, so thank you for coming out. I'd ask you to vacate the chair. The next speaker will be Andrew Waldron, followed by David Jeanson. If I can get Priya Rangrath, and forgive me if I'm butchering your last name. Priya, are you in the crowd? Great, if you can come on up, we'll get you to have a seat as well. So Andrew, you have 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. So my name is Andrew Waldron. I'm speaking on behalf of the National Historic Sites Alliance for Ontario. This is a network of national historic sites dedicated to the protection, improvement, and promotion of these sites. The Chateau Laurier is a National Historic Site, and as such, it must retain its commemorative integrity when there are alterations. While there are no legal obligations as a National Historic Site, the designation means that a higher moral responsibility and protection of public worth is expected of a nationally significant place. The nature of the hotel industry is changing, and the model for luxury hotels is to integrate into their management a condo-type business. We are aware of this at the Queen Elizabeth Hotel, the Ritz-Carlton, the Hotel Vancouver, and the proposals for the Royal York, all in densely urban spaces. The Venerable Railway Hotel is changing. In this case, the Lalge's Larco Investments has a rare opportunity to profit from rooms overlooking a publicly financed and federally managed urban park. The design process for this addition has been a failure since the first iteration, which was expressed by the mayor and in the national news. The architects and conservation architect have been unable to understand the architectural significance of the chateau, the escarpment setting, the public, ceremonial, and federal precincts, the architectural expression of Ottawa versus their Toronto home, or by contrast, the urbanism of Vancouver or Montreal. The generic decorated box with superficial allusions to the hotel has been the result, and it has been endorsed by your city staff. The architects have explored various narratives to explain the addition: contextual, pavilion in the park, minimalism, and then completion of a courtyard. That's what they termed it last week. These changing explanations demonstrate that the addition is yet to be stylistically coherent. The goal is a joy of combined expression. I'll emphasize that, combined expression. We all know that the addition in its current form is a failure, and if built, it will be associated with this council. We know that the Chateau adds to our cultural heritage and improves our quality of life both tangibly and intangibly. It's an unfortunate predicament to be in, but the Alliance reluctantly accepts the motion of the Built Heritage Subcommittee as a last-ditch effort to salvage a flawed design. We recommend that in addition to adopting the subcommittee's motion, the city first seeks a more inclusive consultative role by knowledgeable experts on additions to historic buildings when examining the design refinements proposed in the subcommittee's motion. 2, to provide a peer review process to seek design excellence and achieve a stylistic coherence and contemporary explicitness once the refinements to the final design are considered to have met the subcommittee's modifications, and 3, to encourage the owners to return to the NCC's ACPDAR for design recommendations or approval, whichever. The future of this site will be central on how the area is understood. While the architects have tried to minimize in their presentations the impact the addition will have on the landscape, rather than address the actual built form as a juxtaposition to the chateau, intelligent contrast can be successful. But in this case, the addition does not attempt to be an extension or companion to the chateau. It remains incompatible with the hotel. Councillor Wilkinson asked last week to me, what would be a preferable design? There are many options and examples out there that are successful additions, too many to name. As you know, and I think Peter's letter mentioned it too, Phyllis Lambert wrote to you rejecting the Clues design, and she was able to engage Peter Rose to build a successful addition in a park setting to the Shaughnessy House National Historic Site in Montreal. It's unfortunate that the owners of the property did not decide to have an open and more transparent process that would have drawn national and international acclaim for a bold, architecturally expressive design that was modern and contemporary while also respecting and understanding the qualities of the place. The proposed addition within its current setting demonstrates that there are flaws in heritage processes and legislation.
30 seconds.
Yes, understood. While also demonstrating that the city requires a more rigorous understanding of conservation standards, and this is important, and comprehension of Ottawa's historic values. Okay? We hope that the outcome will be a signature addition to the venerable Chateau Laurier. While the current market forces in the hotel industry is driving these additions to railway hotels, their additions can still respect the architectural, cultural, and civic values of these landmarks in Canadian cities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Andrew. Seeing no questions to delegation, thank you for coming out. And if I could ask you to vacate the seat, I'll ask Lynn Armstrong. Lynn, are you in the crowd? Lynn? Great. If you can come take a seat up front here. At this point, the speaker is David Jeans. You're no stranger to this room. David, you have 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair.
Heritage Ottawa's opposition to the staff recommendation was contained in document 35 of the staff report to Built Heritage Subcommittee and to Planning Committee. It remains our position that the current design fails to respect the cultural heritage value of the Chateau Laurier Hotel and its venerable setting by remaining incompatible with the property's picturesque and romantic sensibility. As you've heard, the standards and guidelines for the conservation of historic places in Canada, which are official city policy, require that additions be physically and visually compatible with the heritage property. Heritage Ottawa and a large body of expert and public opinion believe that the design does not meet this standard. We support the initiative of the Built Heritage Subcommittee to request that the proponent modify the design to, quote, make the proposed addition more visually compatible with the existing Chateau Laurier prior to site plan approval. We also support the BHSC recommendation that Planning Committee lift delegated authority for the approval of the application for site plan, and we're informed that city staff have agreed to this. Heritage Ottawa has strong concerns, however, that the BHSC recommendation does not go far enough to ensure that the subsequent design changes will achieve the design excellence while meeting the standards and guidelines compatibility requirement. We believe that a more robust review process must be established. For this reason, it is important that the review continue to be subject to the Ontario Heritage Act, which does give City Council the right and the responsibility to reject an inappropriate design. In their deliberations, Built Heritage Subcommittee members suggested that the 2017 Heritage Working Group be reconstituted to guide the proponent on subsequent design changes, and Heritage Ottawa was represented on this group, though members of the group have expressed concerns that their views were not reflected in subsequent changes. This group was co-chaired by the City of Ottawa and the National Capital Commission and included both local and national heritage expertise. Built Heritage Subcommittee members also proposed that the Urban Design Review Panel be re-engaged in a formal review of the resulting design, and some members suggested that a further public consultation should take place prior to the application being referred to Built Heritage Subcommittee and Planning Committee. In addition to the measures outlined by Built Heritage Subcommittee, Heritage Ottawa also strongly encourages that recommendation 1E not be approved, and that subsequent design changes should be referred back not only to Built Heritage Subcommittee and Planning Committee, but also to full City Council. It's our firm belief that Ottawa City Council should exercise its full authority under the Ontario Heritage Act by considering all iterations of this significant and historic application. We urge Planning Committee to include these measures as recommendations to Council. Phyllis Lambert, you've heard mentioned as Founding Director Emeritus of the Canadian Centre for Architecture, and I want to point out that when we're talking about modernist architecture, she is one of the architectural pioneers most responsible for bringing modern architecture not only to Canada but also to New York City. In her 20th of June letter to Mayor Watson, she asked, quote, to not allow an addition to the Chateau Laurier that downgrades and undermines the integrity and value of this national landmark and of the great Canadian cultural landscape of which the Chateau Laurier is an integral part. Heritage Ottawa urges you to follow the advice of Ms. Lambert, many other architects and heritage conservation experts, and hundreds of concerned citizens to use your full authority and responsibility under the Ontario Heritage Act to assure that any approved additions to the Chateau Laurier are compatible with and worthy of its importance to Canada's capital. And I just want to mention that Heritage Ottawa has had many media inquiries, as you know. We've had many thousands of responses to the posts on our website. We've received nearly 100 copies of letters that have
30 seconds?
Yes, thank you. We've received well over 100 copies of letters that have been submitted to the committees, to councillors, and to the mayor by members of the public on this subject, and by many people who are acknowledged experts in the architecture or landscape architecture or heritage fields. So we think that you should take that into account and that you must act responsibly with respect to this application on such an important heritage building.
Great. We do have questions, so please don't leave the chair. Councillor Brockington.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Jeans, for your presentation on behalf of Heritage Ottawa. We share a similar concern, and that is that if this is passed, that the architect goes back and presents a 5th version, and it still does not meet those basic criteria that you outlined. And you provided some, I think, useful suggestions for this committee to consider about how that next version gets developed. You talked about reinstituting the working group. You talked about another round through the UDRP and more public consultation. I just want to make sure, and I think those are good suggestions, but that's no guarantee, as we've seen already, that if they choose to go with a 5th version, that it will meet those basic heritage criteria. Is there anything else that you can suggest today to get us to that equilibrium that we need?
Well, I'm afraid what I have to say is that moving forward by approving the recommendations from the Built Heritage Subcommittee, which is the absolute minimum that you should do, we do not believe that the proposal should be accepted without those conditions. But I do share your concern that we are still then dependent on the goodwill, if you like, of the proponent, which we unfortunately can't count on, and the cooperation of City Heritage staff, which we have been assured will be there. But again, you know, staff approved this particular design, which we felt was not acceptable, and one of the key reasons, and it was even stated by the consultant architect who prepared the Cultural Heritage Impact Statement, that the standard for physical and visual compatibility had not been considered as a criterion in determining that this plan met the requirements of the standards and guidelines.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jeans, for coming out today. I'll get you to vacate the seat. Our next speaker is Priya. Priya, the microphone's yours. You have 5 minutes.
I didn't come with a prepared speech.
Yeah, you don't need a prepared speech.
Yeah,
you have 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
I completely applaud the opinions that have been coming from this public bench. I couldn't say it better. I think there's just such an incredible lot of people saying the same things over and over again. And I just wanted to leave just 2 comments, possibly to the Planning Committee. This project is important. It sets a precedent just because democracy matters, people matter, and the people who actually enjoy building, even if they're not trained in it, matter. Their opinion matters. And there's a lot of ideas on coming from the bottom end. And my, it completely seconds what was just said a few minutes ago. Just an appeal to, there's a variety of design proposals, a variety of suggestions. We've just heard a few, maybe the last couple of weeks and today. Just to open that up to more participation. I think we'll have solutions that'll matter. So completely not to shut the door today in just taking things ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Seeing no questions to the delegation, thank you very much for coming out today. If I could get you to turn your microphone off when you leave the chair. Thank you. Next speaker is Lynn Armstrong. Lynn, you have 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
I have some slides that I brought. I'm not sure where they're activated from. If they could be brought up, please.
We'll just, you know what, I want to ensure your slides are up, so we'll just hold the clock and reset it if that's okay. We'll take 2 seconds, get the technical set up to ensure that the presentation goes along with your discussion.
You. Are we ready?
Okay, wonderful. You have 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Hello, my name is Lynn Armstrong. I'm a heritage landscape architect, and my particular concern is for the impact on Major Hills Park and the view that it will have and how it will impact on the park. This is a basic chateau. I just Googled chateau. You can see it's a strong, solid building. It sits firmly in its landscape. It has usually elegant staircases and terraces on both sides of the building, and it's firmly attached to the site that it sits on. There are strong horizontal lines. The massing of the building, there's more stone than glass, and the roof is kind of pushing it down and attaching it to the ground. So, next slide, please. This was the Major Hill Park that the building was actually put on the site of. Part of the site was taken to build the site. Next slide, please. And this is the slide showing the rear of the building now. This was the view of the building with the parking garage, although you can't see it. It was nicely landscaped. You can see the building is sitting in the landscape. It was a good marriage of the park and the building. It gave it an adequate setting, and they worked together. Next slide, please. So why did it bother me, this new addition? And I Googled industrial business park architecture, and you can see in my mind the building that's being proposed is of that style. It's got very strong vertical lines rather than horizontal. It's sitting up on podiums. It's open on the bottom. It's not attaching itself strongly to the ground. And that's now going to be the view. Next slide, please. This is the addition. This is the view now from the park, and you can see that that's now the backdrop of the park. All you see is the roof. You've lost the mass of the chateau building. It's not there, and it's an open podium at the bottom. It's not attached to the ground, and that's what you're going to see. And now it's converting the historic park to basically what you would see in a business park, and a park takes a lot of its style from the buildings that go around it. The park only has benches and lighting standards and the planting design, but it takes a lot of its style from what surrounds it. And I think putting in a building that's sort of an industrial business park building as the main view, where all you're going to see from the park of the chateau is the roofs, you lose that impact and on the park. Can I have the next slide, please? And this is sort of where I get my vision of the business park. This is actually a building that's been built in Barrhaven in a business park. And I'm not an architect, I'm the common man, and when I see the new addition reflects very much this style of building, when I see it, I'm going to read office building, business park, and it totally changes the emphasis of the historic Major Hill Park when it doesn't have a view of, I'm not saying it has to have the view of the Chateau Laurier, but it has to have the mass of a building that's like that and sitting on the ground. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much for the presentation, Ms. Armstrong. I don't see any questions to the delegation, so thank you for coming out today. We do have the applicants in the crowd if there is questions for the applicants. And failing any questions, at that point there'll be questions to staff. And I would like to leave Councillor Nussbaum, the chair of Build Heritage, which has done a tremendous amount of work to wrap up on this. So any questions to the applicant? Any questions to staff at this point? Seeing none, Councillor Nussbaum.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I just thought I would very briefly summarize the outcome from Built Heritage last week. You've heard a number of the public delegations speak to it. In short, I think what we heard last week at Built Heritage was a concern among many, if not all, of the members about the fact that when you look at the standards and guidelines for the conservation of historic places and you look at Standard 11, which again has been referenced already, that the three-part test of distinguishable from, subordinate to, and compatible with wasn't necessarily achieved with the application before us. And due to that discomfort, I worked very closely with the Vice Chair to come up with some very specific ideas on how the committee felt. And this was based largely on the many dozens of comments that we received both from members of the public and from architects throughout Canada. And so the three specific changes that the BHSC put into the motion before us is the meaningful increase of the amount of Indiana limestone cladding, and that was to address the issue of greater material compatibility. The second was sculpting, recessing, and breaking up the north facade. That's the side of the building that faces Major Hills Park, to try and get more undulation, more relief, more breakup of that fairly solid and uniform mass. And the third issue was to have greater articulation of the architectural expression on all three of the public-facing sides, to get to that issue of compatibility with. And we tried to thread the needle, Mr. Chairman, between, on the one hand, giving the applicant and heritage staff specific enough guidance so they knew how to move forward, but on the other hand, not tying their hands, recognizing that this is, at the end of the day, a creative exercise. So we tried to thread that needle with the language you see before you in paragraph 1 of the motion. I want to very quickly address a couple of the other points that were raised and that I think are important for members of this committee to understand in terms of next steps. With Councillor Fleury's agreement, site plan will be lifted, and the idea there is this gives planning and council an opportunity to look at the revised application when it comes back following this discussion between staff and the applicant. And the BHSC will be provided an opportunity to comment before it is tabled at planning. And the reason why you have that specific language is BHSC under the Planning Act doesn't have a formal role on site plan. So we couldn't, and because the heritage permit is going to be issued if council agrees to whatever recommendation planning puts forward this morning, BHSC can't, under the Planning Act, have a more formal role, but the idea was to ensure that they had an opportunity to comment on the application before it comes to planning. And the last point, Mr. Chair, there had been questions about who staff would consult with as part of the discussion they will have with the applicant, and staff were clear last week that they plan to bring forward any revised plan to the UDRP. The UDRP had established a small subcommittee in the spring to provide feedback and work with the applicant and staff. And so staff stated last week that their plan would be to essentially bring that revised application to that same group. So that ensures that we have some of the same players who've been involved in this in terms of an outside advisory role, maintaining their role moving forward. So, Mr. Chairman, that I think explains the key features of the motion. The BHSC recommended to us on a 7-0 vote that we adopt this amended motion. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Councillor Nussbaum. I want to thank you for all the hard work. Chair Harder is back with me here right now, and we know how much you put into this. Also note we have 18 pieces of correspondence that we've also received. So Built Heritage Subcommittee recommendation is amended. Is that carried? Actually, I already called for it, Councillor Fleury. We actually had Councillor Nussbaum as the speaker, but if it's the will of the committee, sorry I missed that there. If you wish to speak, is that okay with the committee? Great. Proceed.
Thank you. So I want to begin by first and foremost thanking the public for the engagement and the participation in this application. There's been a lot of effort by the community, but also by the city in being able to capture all of the comments over the last few months. J'ai aussi beaucoup apprécié.
I also very much appreciated the approach taken by the city, a more relaxed approach with youth. People were ready to be engaged and to fully participate in the process. Since the beginning, rapid corrective measures were taken. I believe that it was important to note this. Obviously, the website helped a lot, and also the efforts made by Allison, the entire team, Allison's team, to respond to the public. This was very much appreciated. I know that there's a certain amount of discomfort on many fronts with what's been presented, but I have to note that it's rare that we have an applicant. Normally the applicants have, and I think it's important to state here that we've talked of Larco, we've talked about the group of Chateau Laurier, and perhaps we're not pleased with the final design, and a lot of work will be done with regards to materials and the architectural approach that will be used. But we do have a very professional group. We can disagree with what's submitted, but if I understand correctly, and with the National Capital Commission, they have followed the process. They've been open to feedback, and they've not threatened to appeal the city's decision. So I believe that in this context, when we look towards the future, there's an opportunity to have a much more a project that will be more widely appreciated by the general population, and it's important to note this, I believe.
Before my final wrap-up comments, I just have two elements. One, which is a direction to staff, which was confirmed by a court query earlier, that staff will continue and review the elevator projections that were further raised beyond the materials and some of the northern facade, that also the elevator projection that would impact some of the view sheds will be carried through in the next steps. So maybe, Court, if you could just, for the record, confirm.
Yes, Councillor, to my far right is Alison Hamlin, lead planner on the site plan application. So we will be looking to work with the applicant through the site plan process on ways in which we can mask any elevator overrun on the top of the building.
Thank you. And then you did share with us, with committee members, kind of the next steps in terms of review and approval. I know that there's an important element, which is the community engagement, which is highlighted here as being a meeting of the revision under the UDRP. Do you have set timelines as to when that could happen, and also how we plan to inform the public of that meeting itself?
Councillor, following Council's approval tomorrow of this report, we will embark upon the site plan process, working with the applicant on the conditions that have been put before us by Council with respect to the cladding and architectural expression of the building. So that process will take a number of months. Our hope is to be in a position to come back to Built Heritage Subcommittee and Planning Committee in the early winter with the site plan. So prior to that, we will be working with that special focused urban design review panel working group. That's a public meeting process that we will advertise on the city's website and can certainly share with your office and any other councillor's office. And then, of course, the public will be able to participate in the review of the report through the Built Heritage and Planning Committee process as well.
Okay. And just as my final comments, I know that the objectives do meet the Section 11 or portion of the Section 11 goals. I spoke about this at committee in terms of the guidelines, and I think that the guidelines are there, and as we sit here at committee and others, if the applicant initially had wanted to amend those guidelines, we would be in a different context. I know that not using the word replica, because that's certainly maybe not what the city staff are comfortable with or desire, but there is, I think it's important to bring to the floor of committee this understanding that if an applicant does want to build something that is similar as an extension, that could have been amended in terms of the guidelines. It's not traditional, it's not typical, but the committee could, if the applicant had wished, reviewed or amended some of those guidelines for a given application. In that context, because we have a more modern building and we've talked about some of the materials, and I continue to be concerned, as I said before, with obviously the overall compatibility of this addition. I'm concerned about the elevator projections, obviously some of the materials, the eastern wall, and respecting the connection between the park and the existing facade and the porte cochère specifically are of concern to me and the community. And also the aspect of, I described it as a slab building just because I'm not an architect and can't speak eloquently to, but this massing of the build form, and obviously that's some of the work that the architect and the team will look forward to. So I want to thank, just as a wrap up, I just want to thank the chair of Built Heritage and the Built Heritage Committee, also the chair of planning who worked with us on the motion that was brought forward. It would have been easy for Built Heritage to just overturn or refuse the staff position, but I think this is a good step in working with the applicant and working with the city for a design that will be worked through and will be better than what we have today. So I want to thank the community, I want to thank city staff, and I want to thank members of council for their efforts in bringing forward an addition that will be representative of such an iconic site in our city's downtown.
Thank you. Built Heritage Subcommittee recommendation as amended. Is that carried? Thank you very much. I'm going to do some seat shuffling. I might need my chair back over there, Catherine. We're going to move on to item number 5, the zoning bylaw amendments for 99 Fifth Avenue. So the first of our delegations is Carolyn McKenzie. If I can get you to come forward into the delegation's chair. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. My name is. Good morning. Welcome. My name is Carolyn McKenzie, and I'm here on behalf of the Glebe Community Association. Just wanted to start out by saying that we've been meeting with Minto in the city over the past year to try and shape this building so that it fits in better with its location on Bank Street. It's right in the heart of the Glebe. The first proposal that Minto came forward with was essentially a 9-story building when you include what was a fairly significant mechanical projection up top. There was a public meeting back in January, and about 200 people, give or take, came out, and I think they've voiced fairly significant concerns around the impact of height and massing of the building on the surrounding homes and on Bank Street itself. The community has also been very concerned about the loss of a number of businesses in the existing building, because those businesses serve the community, and this proposed building will all be residential. At the time, a petition was circulated, and at last count, I would say roughly about 1,000 people had put their names to it. And I mention this specifically just to give an indication of the level of interest that this proposal has attracted. Since then, the building has evolved, and some important changes have been made, although many people remain concerned about how the building will fit into the neighborhood. Again, it is surrounded by what is an existing low-rise residential neighborhood, as well as what tend to be in that stretch of Bank Street, low-rise commercial mixed-use buildings. Once again, I find myself doing this every time I come to Planning Committee, I just want to reiterate that our community is not against development. Most people I talk to both understand the rationale for and support intensification. And from my view, what we've been trying to do is to strike a better balance, so we end up with a community that remains strong and vibrant and that respects our character. It's what we should all want for every community in this city. It's not just about doing something for the Glebe. We can get behind redevelopment on Bank Street, but what we're seeking is development that fits in and transitions better to the existing neighborhood. Development that does not necessarily sacrifice our tree canopy, and I was encouraged to hear some of the earlier discussion at committee on the Mccloud Street proposal in particular, and the interest in saving some of the assets of mature trees in particular in the city. we also are looking at development that does not constitute too much density, given the public amenities that we all need to share, and that remains a bit of an open question. I would like to recognize the efforts of the City and Minto with respect to the amendments that are before you today, and that I would ask you to support. These amendments may seem relatively small, but they are important changes that will help the building to better transition to the two-story residential homes that are right next to this building on 4th and 5th Avenue in particular. I'd also like to thank the city for recognizing what has, we've only got about 8 blocks of Bank Street in the Glebe, but we are facing increasing development pressure on those blocks. And I'm very encouraged by the motion before you as well today to commit to pursuing some sort of secondary plan process as soon as possible in the next term of council that takes a more holistic view at how Bank Street can and should develop. Our hope is that this will allow us to have a more robust discussion and bring greater certainty for everyone regarding built form density and perhaps even land uses. Our community hopes that what comes out of this process of again, secondary plan, and I'm doing this with my hands because I think there's an interest in reviewing that model a bit, that we get a clear vision for our traditional Main Street and a more balanced plan that respects the character and plan functioning of the street and the neighborhood. We're looking forward to working with Stephen Willis and his team on this to find a practical means of getting this done well in a timely and cost-efficient manner. So again, I would ask for your support in passing this motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carolyn, and it should be no surprise to anyone how hard you work on this on behalf of the Glebe Community Association, and as you do on all files, but how many times that you collaborated. And also I thank you for your attention to the work that Minto did in the role that they played. I think that when more and more we're seeing opportunities where the communities where the applications are coming forward are having a healthier process for sure, because we have a willing developer speaking to a willing community association to talk about how can this work. And that's always a best way to go, no matter how long it takes. John, did you want to comment on how you see the secondary plan, or how we are, whatever we're calling it, that's going to benefit the Glebe Community Association?
So, Madam Chair, we're just getting our heads wrapped around in terms of how to frame what's being called the CDP light. I know that the key issue here is sort of the heights, and we've got general official plan policy.
Can you speak a bit louder, please?
Sorry, we're just going through the process of confirming sort of what we would include in what we're calling the CDP light. It's recognized that the primary issue here really is around density and in particular height. And while the official plan has general policy direction on that, I think there's a recognition that this area could benefit from having a closer look at some of the contextual considerations that really come into play. So that's what we're really going to be directing our energies towards in terms of trying to frame out what that's going to look like.
So you mentioned CDP light. Is that going to have the teeth necessary that's going to give the confidence to the community?
Again, Madam Chair, I think it's a little bit early stage right now to confirm exactly what the process is, whether this translates into a secondary plan or more specific direction in the framework of the zoning directions that are established. We haven't gotten to that point yet, but that's definitely something that we're taking a look at.
So let me ask you this, because I know this is not going to tie up this particular file, but before we go forward, it's very important to have it. So when would we have that discussion, so we'd have that level of confidence as to when you would have that in the in the upcoming work plan?
So, Madam Chair, just
with the community.
Yeah. So, Madam Chair, it's our intention to meet with the community shortly, the next little while, to refine the scope of the exercise. If we need to go into a secondary plan, we will. It's just with changes to the provincial planning legislation, that may not be necessarily the ideal thing, but if that's something that's important to the community, we will go there. We most certainly will be looking at zoning changes, and we'd like to meet with the community within the next couple of weeks to map out a work program that would then come on our 2019 work plan.
So I like that next couple of weeks. Maybe you would want to share any vacation dates that you have, so we can make sure that that does happen. Thank you very much for coming out. To the sound people, can the sound go up in here at all? Because I don't know about anybody else, but normally at council it's not this difficult to hear. Thank you. Thanks, Carolyn. Next up, we have, oh, did you have, oh, Carolyn, come on back. See, I'm not frazzled or anything. I'm just like not in play yet. And thank you for everybody for your patience. I actually thought yesterday, I told my staff to phone the school and say that I couldn't come because of today's meeting. And on the way home to Barhaven yesterday, I thought, you know what, you haven't missed one meeting. This is your grandson. And they actually allowed me to not just come on the stage, but to introduce him and to hand him his certificate. So it was really important to me. Councillor Nussbaum?
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick comment and a question to the speaker. Firstly, Carolyn, thank you for the work you've done on this. The submission that you wrote, I thought, was very, very thorough. And given that you did this in your volunteer time, a credit to you and the association. I recall that when we were dealing with what I call the beer store application, the GCA was very concerned with the notion of transition and very focused on the village feel of Bank Street, and the sense that because a lot of the zoning on Bank Street was 4 stories, yes, in the official plan you can see the opportunity to go up to 6 in certain circumstances. So my question to you is, given that the GCA has come forward in this case and is recommending that we agree with the staff recommendation for the revised up to 7 stories, do you feel that you have the assurances that you needed from staff to ensure that this is not a precedent for the remainder of Bank Street, given your strong views on with the road width being what it is and your concerns about 45-degree angular plane? So I'm just curious what assurances you feel, or the confidence you feel, that this 7-story application is not a wedge or a precedent for the remainder of Bank Street, which I know is dear to the GCA's heart.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. I guess in short, I don't think that we have any particular assurance of that. I know in every community where proposals are coming forward and it's a bit more than what people are looking for, residents in the Glebe and elsewhere always say, well, are worried, and they ask about, will this set a precedent? And to my understanding, the question from city staff is not no and not yes. It's every project, every application will be considered on its merit. So to that extent, I don't think we have any, this doesn't provide us with any particular assurance. In the beer store, when we were able to go back and agree on a settlement with the proponent in that case before going to the OMB, to bring down the height to 4 stories in the northern portion of that building, I guess our logic followed on from the logic of planning staff, which was to approve the additional height of that building because it provided a transition from the greater height of Lansdowne down to the low-rise condition, residential and commercial heading north. So picking up on that, our view was, okay, if that makes sense, then let's have that building similarly transition. So to the southern end of the building was higher, the northern end of the building was lower as it moved northwards into the Glebe. So 4 stories. Now we find this building going up to, well, the original proposal was sort of 8 or 9 stories, depending on how you look at it. Now we're looking at 7 stories. So yes, in short, it is a concern that height will possibly be, there will be, basis for further applications coming forward and us seeing applications for further height going northward into the up Bank Street. That's clearly continues to be a concern. I guess our hope is that as before, I mean, that past year we've been working with Minto. The year and a half, 2 years before that, we were working with the beer store proponents. Dealing with these applications one by one as the height marches up the street. It's both time consuming. As you know, I do have a day job. This has got to be, done around the sides, and it is extremely time consuming. And it also, so perhaps not sustainable. And then the other consideration is that it dealing with these on a one-off basis does breed a lot of cynicism within the community, and that cynicism is born of people looking at the zoning bylaw, which says 4 stories, and then proposals come in for 8 or 9 stories, whatever, and then very quickly we're moving towards that greater height. So I think we need to do what we can, whether it's CDP light, secondary plan process, to try and reduce that. We need some room to maneuver for architects to bring forward different design solutions so that we can see rejuvenation in the street. But right now that gulf is just is so wide that it is breeding a lot of cynicism. Sorry, that's a long-winded answer to your question. But hopefully, if we can get a secondary plan or something like that in place, in itself, hopefully that will make the whole question of precedent somewhat moot.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Carolyn.
Thank you.
Vice Chair Tierney has a technical amendment to move.
I'll just go for the therefore be resolved. And I don't know who writes these things, but they're pretty big, so there's a lot of chapters in here, so get ready. Therefore, be resolved that the Planning Committee direct the General Manager of Planning, Infrastructure and Economic Development to review the opportunities for a limited secondary plan. Process focus on the identification of the appropriate height and density strategy for those properties fronting directly adjacent to Bank Street from the Highway 417 to the Rideau Canal, with the accompanying modifications to the zoning bylaw, and report back to Planning Committee no later than Q4 2019. Therefore, it be resolved that the Planning Committee recommend Council approve the General Manager of Planning, Infrastructure and Economic Development Department to be delegated the authority through the site plan process to approve the design changes to the southeast corner of the site and attempt to preserve the existing, it says mature, but I'm sure that's nature, trees mature trees such as cut out of Area D, or the measures deemed appropriate. Therefore, it be resolved that Planning Committee recommending to Council approve the new portion on the rear of the building and facing the rear yards of the residential neighborhood to the east, labeled Area I, be limited to the 4 stories of the maximum height of no more than 13 meters to the section of Area E on the 4th and 5th Avenues and wrapping around the corner of the rear of the building, remaining 5 stories with a maximum of 15.8 meters. Therefore, be it further resolved that the Planning Committee recommend Council approve Document 3, schedule of the original staff report, be replaced with Document 3 schedule attached here within. Therefore, be it further resolved that Planning Committee recommend to Council approve Document 2 of the staff report, be revised as follows. A, revise Section 1, read rezone lands in Document 1 from TMH to TMS. You can see it in front of you on the screen. B, revise Section 2A to read in column 2. Add the text TM. Again, you can read that on the screen. C, revise Section 2B to add the following. The holding symbols may be lifted only when the following conditions have been met. I, review the details of site plan, landscape plan, building elevations, and urban design review, and 2, submissions and approvals of the site plan committee application and satisfaction to the General Manager of Planning, Infrastructure and Economic Development, and be it further resolved that no further notices pursuant to subsection 3417 of the Planning Act.
So much for just the therefore. So I think that Robert Brocklebank, are you here? Yeah, come on up. Kirsten, can you just explain in easy language why he was moving that technical amendment?
Thank you, Chair. So, working through this process, planning prepared a report with a recommendation, including a detailed zoning schedule, showing the building form to be permitted on the site. After the report was completed, the Glebe Community Association continued to work with planning staff and Minto and the councillor in moving forward with a revised building format that would address those transitions, especially in the rear of the building adjacent to the residential neighborhood. So this motion just introduces a revised schedule with further step backs at the rear to bring sections of the building down to 4 stories where they were 5 before. And to also introduce a holding symbol to ensure that we continue to work together and that everybody is satisfied, especially in relation to the mature tree on the corner. before a site plan is approved.
Good, thank you. Robert, welcome. Try to speak a little bit louder because it's...
I have a very loud voice, Madam Chair.
Yes, you are. There you go. You have 5 minutes.
I have already submitted some comments in writing, but in view of the comments by the chairman and also by subsequent developments such as this motion, I'd like to make some other comments. I began by noting that we had previously been assured that zoning was no longer to be a mere suggestion. That assurance was given to us in the Planning Summit of 2012. Somehow this document suggests to me that zoning continues to be nothing but a suggestion. I have two concerns. One, it seems to me that there are exemptions from the constraints of zoning which are being permitted here, but there's no particular justification. And the second problem I have is that in the public consultations that were held, there was misinformation that was conveyed. And unfortunately, that doesn't establish a good basis for our required discussions about a secondary plan or other features, or frankly for the new official plan. So first, what is it I'm concerned about in the specifics? Well, what would be wrong with building this project in accordance with the constraints of the zoning? It would be quite possible to intensify in a building that's 15 meters tall, in a building with side yard setbacks of 3 meters, and with a rear yard setback of 7.5 meters. Not only would that be quite possible, I suggest it would probably be quite successful. And we wouldn't have to have this meeting at all. My concern about the misinformation. The misinformation was, we were told that, gee, the zoning bylaw is void. That 5-meter height, it's not true, because the reference saying up to 6 stories in the official plan rendered the zoning bylaw void. I don't think that's true. I think that's misinformation. A misinterpretation of the official plan was used to confuse the public about what was in fact permitted on site. Now they're applying for permission to go beyond 15 meters. That's fine. But please don't tell the public that as of right you can build a 6-story building. You don't. The second thing that concerned me was that the argument was presented that it was possible within the present structure of the zoning bylaw to move massing around on a site. I'm not saying it's a bad idea. I just don't see the legal basis on which you can do that. I've searched in the zoning bylaw for this concept about picking up massing in one place and adding it over there. And that's in fact what was at one point proposed for this site. To take the building potential above the shops on Bank Street and move it over and put it on top of the apartment building being built behind. Well, if we're going to do that, let's have a legal basis on which that can be done. Let's write that into the zoning bylaw. And you might think I'm a great defender of the zoning bylaw. I'm really not. I was there at the beginning. It's like making sausage. It's better not to know what goes into it, because all we did was we forced all the previous zoning bylaws into the comprehensive zoning bylaw. It was not a pleasant process, but it had to be done. So I'm not saying we should have a static bylaw. I don't worship it. But we should have a way that gives the zoning bylaw what our chairman called teeth. The zoning bylaw should have some meaning. It should not be out of sync with the official plan. It should be dynamic. It should be changing with changing circumstance. And that's why I welcome the idea that we're going to have this study. Whether the study should be confined narrowly, the study should be conducted all across the city. Everywhere in this city, we probably have zoning constraints that are out of date. Let's not make our city into Upper Canada Village on the Rideau. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for coming out today. I'll just remind you that at 12:30 we are taking a scheduled break for half an hour. Next up is Judy Peacock, and Carol Mccloud, can you come up and take the chair beside Judy? Is Carol here? There you are. Thank you. And then after they speak, then we have the applicants. You have 5 minutes for presenting. Welcome.
Probably the worst time to be speaking, just before lunch. I hope you can hear me over the rumbling tummies. What's been spoken about 99 Fifth Avenue and the massing of the building has been said very well. And I want to address two other things. I would like to talk about the social and public impact on the neighborhood. Now, I'm not a neighbor of this building. I live quite far away, so I don't have a particular interest in it. I'm in the neighborhood where I've lived since 1974. One thing that worries me very much about this development is the loss of public amenity. When the 99 Fifth Avenue was built as it is now, and was given permission by this council to be built in that form, one of the chief arguments for its development at that time was that it contained a wonderful inner courtyard with a fountain that would become a public amenity in perpetuity and would be very welcome in all the winters to come. It would be a space for the community and for casual dropping in and social interaction. Now, although the space is on private property, it has become the public domain. And we're just about to lose it completely because there will be no public access within the new building. We were told at meetings that because it's in a public space, there was no recourse to this, that it was no longer going to be a public amenity. But I understand that anything that was built as a public amenity before 1996 actually legally cannot be removed once people have been using it. If it was built before 96, I think it was 96, without general agreement. And I think we need more of a legal opinion from the city as to whether or not the courtyard in Fifth Avenue Court can be closed off. There are 3 access and egress points, one to Fifth Avenue, one to 4th Avenue, and one to Bank Street. And if it is closed off and can legally be closed off, can there be some sort of quid pro quo by the developer to provide some form of social amenity? Because this has become a very well-loved and used space within the neighborhood, which is quite short of areas where people can casually gather, especially in the winter. So that was one of the things I wanted to talk about with social impact. The second thing I would like to say very quickly is that the city has spent a lot of time and money with Nature Conservancy Canada and also with Safe Wings Ottawa to produce a leaflet which has been circulated in huge stacks at all public buildings around the city about how windows kill birds. And in this leaflet and in the report that the city and Nature Conservancy Canada and Safe Wings came up with was the recommendation to which the city agreed that all future buildings should have windows in them with these special glass settings inside that do not cause accidental bird strikes. We know, and it says in the leaflet, that retrofitting with decals and all sorts of other things is useless. And the city has strongly recommended that these windows be strike-proof. So I hope that the city will enforce its own recommendations with regard to the windows, and please look into the legality of closing off this public amenity. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. And as far as the windows go, that will be looked at through the site plan process. Kirsten? She's saying yes. Thank you for coming out today. Next up, we have Carol Mccloud, and then we have the applicants for questions if you want to ask them questions. Before we go on to you, Carol, do any of you need to speak if there aren't questions? Okay, perfect. Thank you. Go ahead, Carol. Thanks very much, Ms. Peacock, for coming out.
Madam Chair and Committee, I support the Glebe Community Association's position, but I'd also like to give you a sense of issues my immediate neighbors have with Minto's proposed development. I moved to 4th Avenue. Can you hear this all right? I moved to 4th Avenue in 1975, just as Minto released its plans for 5th Avenue Court. It was to be Ottawa's Lothian Muse, with trendy owner-operated shops and a courtyard for public events. Most recently, Minto provided space for the city's Ottawa 2017 office. The neighbors generally favored the commercial opportunities and gathering place offered by 5th Avenue Court, but shop owners couldn't afford Minto's rents, as high as any in the city. 3 Tarts and Kaleidoscope Books tried to make a go, but as rents climbed, they were forced to move. Public events in 5th Avenue Court had a longer history. For several years, the NAC held its Christmas fair, and it welcomed art shows and similar events. Eventually, even those events disappeared. 5th Avenue Court provides commercial space for the professional offices so necessary to a viable community. My neighbors value the fact that their doctor, dentist, physiotherapist, or chiropractor are within a five-minute walk of home. These professionals, accessible to neighbors and me and so needed in a walkable community, may be forced out of the glebe because our community has no affordable, accessible commercial space. I recognize that it's not Minto's business to provide commercial space for professionals serving the community. Minto's business is making money, plain and simple, and that it sets out to do with this proposed 7-story condo with 121 units in the heart of the glebe. As the city planner report notes, I and overwhelming majority of my neighbors oppose this development. We object to its height, density, massing, and traffic challenges it will exacerbate. If the development conformed to existing zoning and infill guidelines, the issue would not be a problem. The developer wants to overbuild on the property in every way, yet inexplicably, while city planners acknowledge a number of elements of the development that are well above existing rules, they nevertheless support it. Let's take the elements one by one. Height. The existing height limit is 15 meters. A developer can squeeze 5 stories. On Bank Street, from the Queensway to the Rideau River, the zoning is the same. Examples of developers who have conformed, apparently profitably, to the city's existing rules include Domicile at Bank and Strathcona, the Bank and Clemo development approved by this committee earlier this year, Kitty Corner from the Minto site at 5th and Bank, the beer store North End referenced earlier, and at Grove and Bank in Ottawa South. Ottawa wants to build to 22 meters, 25 on the mechanicals on the northeast corner of the building overshadowing 4th Avenue. Why, when other developers are held to city rules, should Minto be granted exemption? Density. The city wants to encourage densification to alleviate urban sprawl, but 121 units is 1.5 times the total number of dwellings currently on 4th Avenue. More units than the 13-story Tarrant Tower at 1st and the Queen Elizabeth Drive, on half the footprint. The units are not designed for families, a problem that Minto Beechwood shared. Added to the 36 condos at 4th and the Canal, this is a huge population increase for a downtown street. Massing. Recently, Glebe residents spent a lot of time helping the city develop infill guidelines. It was a good process, now largely ignored for development in our community. This development puts a brick on its first 3 stories and set back an H in the building's eastern facade to assuage massing concerns. According to city bylaw, a building must be 7.5 meters from the rear lot line, 1.3 meters from the side lot line. According to the infill guidelines, new builds should line up with existing buildings. However, with minor tweaks, Minto proposes to build to the maximum of the lot. The facades of the townhouses on 4th and 5th are well forward of the porches of existing houses along both blocks. Traffic and parking. There are currently 70-odd spaces at 5th Avenue Court for business and staff and patrons. Minto proposes a 2-story parking garage with 13 spaces for guest commercial parking. The remaining spaces will be sold to condo owners, likely at the Lansdowne price of $35,000 a spot. Minto will sell unsold spaces to other owners. True, the city has a parking garage at 3rd and Bank, but people being people, those who do not buy parking spaces will park on street. Also, if the Lansdowne experience is replicated, more than a few of the units will be run as Airbnbs. Ask any Homewood resident what happens when Airbnb tenants find they have no parking. Traffic will be affected. I hope you've read my neighbor's submissions on the subject. Suffice to say that now traffic is directed from the driveway onto 5th, O'Connor, and 4th. To get to the condo garage, owners will turn left across traffic on Bank at an intersection that already has a high collision rate, and left again, a rush hour nightmare.
Ms. Mccloud, your 5 minutes is up.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear a warning.
Your 5 minutes is up?
I didn't hear a warning. Did somebody give me a warning?
No, we don't. I don't usually say last minute. I find it interrupts people's
Oh, I'm sorry. I was expecting a 30-second warning, so
how about I'll give you 30 seconds because you're expecting that.
Saddest, since November 29th, when Minto filed its application, the city has treated its citizens cavalierly. Although the city planner argues otherwise, consultation with community over this major development has been limited. The result of this is that people no longer feel they have agency. They stop participating in the democratic process. Watch numbers fall in this next municipal election. People wonder, what's the point? That should concern us all.
Thank you very much. Thank you both for coming out. Okay, so you heard the applicants have said that they're willing to ask. Pardon me? No, there aren't any questions. Thank you, though. The applicant is offering to answer questions. Does anyone have any questions of the applicants? Okay. Of staff? Okay, so our hard stop's coming up in 2 minutes. We'll stop now. Is that going to work with the... Hang on a second. Hang on a second. For those people, how many people have to leave at 12:30? Okay, so you know what? We'll have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We'll still have quorum. Let me check again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So the 2 of you can go to your meeting, and we'll go to questions of staff from the people that are on committee that are still here. And then we'll break. After we'll vote, and then we'll break, and then the half hour will start from there. But it allows the 2 of you to go to your meeting. Okay? Thank you. All right. So back to Councillor Brockington was it first, and who else wants to ask questions of staff? And Minto, hang around in case the questions end up coming up to you as well. So Councillor Brockington.
I want to speak at the end.
Yes, I figured you did.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Question for staff. One of the first therefore clause in this motion talks about a limited secondary plan process. That's actually quite a large zone going from the Queensway to the canal along Bank Street as the spine. Was this part of the plan originally, or is this being inserted in there as a result of, I guess, community sentiment that a CDP is overdue?
Well, I'm going to go back to Mr. Smith because he's already answered this. Remember at the beginning when I asked him to comment when Carolyn was up here. Can you elaborate further on what you were talking about, John?
Madam Chair, I was having a side conversation with Mr. Wills. I didn't quite catch the question.
So Councillor Brockington, can you ask Mr. Smith the question?
Just in short, is the CDP that's being proposed as part of this motion, was this originally part of the work plan, or is this coming about due to community sentiment comments as part of this process?
Madam Chair, this was not part of the original work program. This is certainly coming as a result of the frequency of planning applications we've been getting in the Bank Street corridor, and certainly Council's previous direction was that we should be completing transit-oriented development plans within the Greenbelt area, but as stage 2 of the LRT will take several years, we still think we can get back to do that and go back and adjust 2 or 3 areas within the Greenbelt with high development pressures where we feel that updating existing plans will be address some of the high priority issues being raised in the community. We at a previous committee, we had committed to doing the Westboro Community Design Plan update. We were adding the Bank Street to that list.
But I think that was a motion that my colleague had put forward. I'm raising this, Madam Chair, is because I have CDPs that are over 20 years old, where there is significant development going on now where that hasn't been the case. And I'm not opposed to this motion, but it brings up to the fact that we have multiple CDPs that are far surpassed. Their vintage is quite old, and I'm just trying to get a better sense as we go in transition to the next council how we're going to deal with CDPs, particularly those that are quite aged. So, I mean, that may take some time to answer, but I'm concerned that, you know, some folks are striking while the iron's hot. Yes, it's germane to raise this. It's probably appropriate to review that. But are there other neighborhoods that can make equally the same type of arguments for refreshing CDPs that really have no planning merit anymore? We've just, you know, evolved so much within the last couple decades. So what is the plan to refresh existing CDPs that are quite old at this time?
Okay, before Mr. Willis responds, I just want to say that we are responding to a unique situation with volumes of applications in the Glebe, Bank Street in particular, and certainly as we just did with Councillor Leeper in his area, they don't have a secondary plan, let alone any other means of having any kind of firmness. I don't think personally that we know where we're going to go with CDPs in the future, whether we're going to continue to have the CDP we know. I know that Councillor Leeper is looking for more certainty, and we're going to be doing a mini zoning study that's going to benefit his. And so that may be a direction that we go in. But Mr. Willis?
Madam Chair, in the work plan that we're developing for the next official plan review, we want to tackle this issue about how we can do a better job of keeping our plans current. Because one of the problems with so many community design plans, secondary plans, trying to keep that volume of them up to date has actually been a real challenge for the department. And I'm very cognizant of the point the councillor's been making. We'd like to find a way to do that. So we will be proposing a new methodology for neighborhood level planning as part of the official plan review process to address the concern the councillor has raised. However, in the short term, in 2 areas with very, very high frequency of applications clustered in a very small geographic area, that being Westboro and the second being Bank Street, high concentration, very small geographic area. We would like council's consent to modify the work program previously provided to focus on getting those up to date first before proceeding to other TOD sites that are further out, knowing that the train is a few years coming.
Please. There we go. I could just eagerly argue that in Riverside Park North, that has seen basically no development in decades, is now seeing significant development. I can make the same argument. What I'm looking for as a member of council is, rather than doing these one-offs, looking at the city as a whole. And so I can be assured that neighborhoods I'm completely not involved in, that if CDPs are required, that we're doing that. And we're doing that because it's the right thing to do. So I'm not going to argue against Westboro or the Glebe, because I think arguments have been sound why they need to be done. But I'm looking at CDPs in my own area which are completely out of date. They have really no planning sense now when we're looking at the types of planning applications that are coming forward. But when I saw this today, I thought we really do need to look at this in the next term of council, and I'm comforted by your comments. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great. So looking around the table, I don't see anybody else on the deck. Oh, yeah, hit the button there. There you go.
There we go. Thank you, Chair. The key discomfort I have is with the size of the wall butting the properties that are to the east of this building. The rear yard of this building is supposed to have a 7.5 meter step back from the lot line. The rear lot line is the line that runs north-south along those eastern properties. Is there any more color than you can give me around why we are recommending in favor of something that doesn't have that 7.5 meter step back, other than what's on page 14 of the planning report? As I read the planning report, it says it's okay not to have a rear yard setback of 7.5 meters because it matches the side yard setback requirement on the street, which is 1.5 meters. That does not make sense to me. There's a reason that we treat traditional Main Street buildings differently. Why is this okay?
Thanks for your question. So I'm just going to bring up the zoning schedule here. In response to Councillor Lieber's question about the step backs, it's a little bit hard to see here, but we've used some color just to illustrate the different transitions and heights, just to make it easier for everybody to understand. So here we have a 2-story portion. So as you can see, and this is part of the motion that came forward earlier today, is that at the rear of the building, the motion and this new schedule shows that that building height will actually be 2 stories high. And in relation to the adjacent residential neighborhood, that lines up generally with the built form of the detached and semi-detached buildings to the east. And as you can see here in the zoning schedule, there is a cutout in the middle of the building, and that is intended to respect that rear yard condition moving east in that breathing space that is currently enjoyed by residents. So with that 2-story component, it also moves up to, you can see this is the 3-story component. The permitted development to the east in the R3 zone permits up to 3 stories, so up to 10.7 meters within a 3-unit, maximum 3-unit building. So this is not out of line or uncharacteristic of the permitted built form that can be developed and is developed there today. So planning is comfortable and that this is consistent with the official plan policies and that this does provide sufficient transition to the existing neighborhood with the height, also with the 1.5 meter setback. So there is a 1.5 meter setback on the east edge. This is consistent with the required setbacks for the R3 zone to the east. So the R3 zone allows up to even as low as 0.6 meter setback. So you can see that that is characteristic, and you will see this built form. And with the development of this, it will create a continuance of that street front and a continuance of that that built form, that side yard setback condition, and even of the height that is permitted there today.
I think the key difference, though, is that smaller setback for the R3 is between buildings that overall have, an R3 built mass. What we're proposing here is, despite the step backs after the various different levels, is a 7-story building going up. So somebody in their rear yard, immediately behind, immediately in the courtyard of this building, there may be the appropriate step back, but they are still seeing 7 floors rising up with relatively minimal step backs. And I'm sorry, I'm just not comfortable with the mass of this building directly up against the R3 without some sort of the transition that we would ordinarily require under the TM zone of that 7.5 meters to the rear lot line.
I guess just to provide more information, what we can show further in the zoning schedule is, so this 2- and 3-story component on the east edge is set back 1.5 meters from the property line. And then we have a 4-story component and a 5-story component. And with the side yard setback plus a step back, so that's 3.5 meters from the east property line, plus the setback that the neighbor to the east also enjoys. And then further to that, we have a 4-meter step back for the 6-story. So the 7-story is set back significantly from the east property line and from the east residential neighborhood for a total of, so we have 4 meters, 2 meters, 9.5 meters. If I'm doing my math, yes. 9.5 meters in total. So that actually exceeds the 7.5 meter setback and provides that stepped transition in height to the existing residential neighborhood. And with the work of the Glebe Community Association, as we see here, that the height has been lowered to provide that better transition and more sensitivity, especially at the rear, transitioning into the rear property, rear backyards of those properties.
All right, thank you.
Minto, one more time, you're still good? We have no questions for you? Okay, Councillor Chernyshenko.
Thank you very much. At great risk at the end of a long morning, I'm going to use a metaphor, or perhaps invent a metaphor here to try and illustrate where I am at. And I believe, as we've heard from the community representatives here, people who've come out to speak are at, and the hundreds who have not bothered to come out to speak about this project, who in the past would have done so. And it's not because they're happy with it. It's quite frankly because they've given up. And that is very unfortunate. This is a project where I am choosing not to ask you to vote against the amendments that we have in front of us. They are better than what we were facing. They are an improvement, so therefore I'm asking you to support them, and I won't be disingenuous. I don't have a vote here at planning today, but when it comes to council, I won't be disingenuous and say, hey, you guys do the dirty work, vote for it, and I'll vote against it. But thanks very much. No, where we're at really here, and here's my metaphor with this project, is I feel like I've run up against a wall enough times that my head hurts. And I don't want to do it anymore. I don't think the problem is actually my head. I think the problem is the wall. I think the problem is that we have supposed zoning certainty and planning certainty. We have a community who expects that they have it, and yet time after time we've actually seen that the documents that we think give certainty don't actually do that. So that has to be repaired, because if we cannot repair the situation where we have, if we needed a community design plan as has been asked for, where we have zoning and an official plan, where people can say, barring some truly exceptional circumstance where an applicant can make a really strong argument for exception, you cannot expect to come into a neighborhood in a main street that's zoned for 15 meters and present, so let's say 4 stories, present 8 or 9 stories, and then bring it back down to 7 and say, look, we listened to the community. But it's still 3 stories beyond what the zoning says. It's still 3 stories beyond, not to mention the setbacks and the issues that my colleague Councillor Leeper were raising. It still smacks to anyone without a planning background, and even those with often, as inappropriate to its context. I'm not here again to make a passionate rallying cry to try to overturn this project, because I've done that enough times and lost every time, and just feel like I don't have the energy anymore for that. What I have the energy for, and we have to be working on now, is providing that certainty. We heard it a few years ago, but it hasn't happened yet. Otherwise, we will get what we've heard people say here today, is the community, they came out, they came to the first public meeting, 300 of them, raised their concerns, they sent in letters, but then they've really just disengaged. They've disengaged because they've said it in their letters to us. What's the point? Why would I even try to understand planning and try to make a clear planning-based argument when it's going to go through anyway? And we are at the point where it's going to go through anyway, is really what people feel. So here we have a project today. You've heard me. It may seem illogical. I'm not going to argue for you to vote against it. I feel particularly the commitment to a CDP is very important. And I feel that if it's going to go through, as the voting record seems to show it will, it's critical that these particular design improvements be made, but that ultimately we have to reach a point where a traditional main street remains a traditional main street, and that is somewhere in the 4 to 6 story range at most. It's not 7 stories, and we have to get back the trust of the broader community that planning means something and that their voices do count for something. Thank you.
Well said, Mr. Councillor Chernachenko. I just wanted to say that I think that I don't know that people are giving up as much as you know, they are. You can't say that when you've got people in the community that work as hard as you do, and certainly others do, and others that are here today. But you know, I think something else that we've seen because of that work that's being done by your community, going out to, I did a little bit of a count here. The detailed consultation with the Glebe Community Association 7 times, plus they had 2 open houses. I think one of them was on a Saturday, well attended, and that and people were engaged. I think what's changed and why it's really important that that next piece comes forward so that we have something definite that holds up, that we actually, that has the teeth in it that we've been looking for. I see a difference in the developers that are also developing in the Glebe area, and they are strongly believing that it's important that they work as closely as they can. And I think that we saw evidence. This is a good example of an applicant and the community and yourself working really hard, and staff. So I want to thank everyone that was involved, and I'm pleased that we've come up with a solution today that I think that whether it's, you know, no matter what it is that you were concerned on, I think that there's been movement that has that is supporting that. So I really hope that the next step that we are looking forward to with the process, Mr. Willis, will be something that you do define in the next 2 weeks. We at least have that conversation so we know what that's going to look like, and then we can message it to the community as well. So we have a technical amendment that was moved by Vice Chair Tierney. Is that carried? Carried, and on the item as amended? Carried. Dissent by Councillor Leeper. Thanks again, Councillor Chernachenko, and everybody that came out today. So we are going to take a half-an-hour break. Oh, wait a minute. Not yet. We're going to... what? So we also, I wanted to say that Councillor Fleury has, again, has an item on the agenda.
Great.
That he's not going to be here to speak to, so we're going to defer it again.
I'm moving the motion to move it to the next Planning Committee meeting, which is July 10th.
Which is July 10th. Okay? Carried? Pardon? It's item number 15, yes. Yeah. Pardon me? Well, I hope so, because his next chance is the end of August. But anyways, we'll defer it, right? And so we'll give him that opportunity on the 10th. All right, everybody, so we'll just take a little bit of a recess for half an hour, so we'll be back at 1:20.